Welcome to the Beer Taster's Notebook, the show dedicated to learning about beer. I'm Jonathan Thompson, advanced cicerone, beer judge, home brewer, and beer writer. Welcome back to the Beer Taster's Notebook, episode 12, an introduction to malt. So, malt is one of the key ingredients in beer, of course, and it's slightly less complex than hops and less complicated than yeast, so we're going to start here. Barley being the major grain used for malting, so we're going to stick with that for now and then do grain-specific episodes down the line like rye or wheat. So what's so special about barley? Well, first, it's pretty easy to grow, so accessibility is clearly going to be a major factor there, but it's also kind of the whole package. So barley contains all the fermentable materials and the required nutrients and all the endogenous enzymes needed for conversion, and it also has a husk which acts as a filter bed, which can be super important for mashing, lautering specifically. And so aside from providing sugars that the yeast can metabolize into alcohol and carbon dioxide, the malt also contributes flavor and color and body to the beer. Manipulation of the grain bill can result in a very different beer, all things being equal. So same hops, same yeast, same water, same process, different malt, different beer. Okay, so let's start in the field. So barley grows in a vast array of conditions. It prefers cooler climates and well-drained soil, but it's fairly drought tolerant and frankly can grow in wetter climates with clay-heavy soil as well. It's also more tolerant of higher alkalinity than many other cereal grasses, giving it that kind of geographic diversity. And so barley is a cereal grass, as I just mentioned. It is closely related to wheat and rye. Hordeum vulgare spontaneum is the Latin name for your notes there. But in brewing, we talk about 2-row and 6-row barley. There is a 4-row variety, but it's very rarely mentioned, so we won't bother. So the nomenclature here refers to the rows of kernels running up and down the rachis, which is the tip of the stalk. And so if you look directly at the barley from above, these rows become quite obvious, with the 6-row resembling a 6-spiked star, and the 2-row, I guess it's a 2-spiked star, but you can see those rows, they're very obvious. So 6-row is the more common variety in North America, while 2-row dominates in Europe. 6-row is actually a mutated 2-row, specifically the VRS1 gene. And we don't really need to get into the weeds here, but VRS1 suppresses the development of lateral rows. And so 6-row has the advantage of being more climate tolerant, but with some inherent disadvantages. The 6-row is higher in protein, which is good for yeast, good for foam, bad for haze. Also, too much protein can cause a bunch of other issues. But on the flip side, it's lower in saccharides, which are the fermentables. And so the husk is also thicker. More husk means more polyphenol extraction potential, and this means more haze and potentially some higher astringency. So here's the cool part. 6-row contains a ton of enzymes. And this means that not only does it have the power to convert its own starches into fermentable sugars, but it also means that it can spare plenty for adjunct brewing. So we'll get all into this in detail shortly. But 6-row is higher in S-methylmethionine, which is a sulfur compound that serves as sort of the precursor to dimethyl sulfide, DMS, which is that cooked cabbage or canned corn aroma that nobody really wants. So obviously you got to be very careful there. And so within the 2-row and 6-row categories are seasonal varieties. So namely winter and spring barley. Both take about 60 to 70 days to fully grow, and then 120 to 130 days inclusive to reach full maturity. Winter barley is sown in the fall and then harvested sort of midsummer, and spring barley is sown in the spring and then harvested late summer, early fall. Spring barley is the variety most often destined for malting. So most of barley, like around 70%, is actually slated for animal feed. In this case, a higher protein variety is obviously desired. And then some goes to human food, but the rest goes to malting. And so a bit of anatomy here. The barley kernel or barley corn is the seed from which a new plant will grow. Obviously, it's kind of hard to describe without a visual, but essentially there's a husk inside of which is an embryo and an endosperm surrounded by various layers. The endosperm houses most of the starches and makes up about 55 to 75% of the total weight of the kernel, obviously depending on the variety. The embryo, when hydrated, releases enzymes, mostly amylase, cytase, and pepsidases. And those start to break down the protein matrix in which are locked all these starches within the endosperm. And so they also start to break apart the starches a little bit, which is what's called modification. The acrospire, which is the start of the new stalk of the new plant, starts to grow inside the kernel. And so obviously in nature, this would just keep growing, using up the starches and other macronutrients as energy and building blocks, and then we'll get, a new barley plant. This is great, but of course not for beer. So we kind of need those starches amongst other things to make the beer. And so this is where malting differs from nature. Okay, so into the malt house. So we have barley that's now been harvested and cleaned and stored, and at this point we're assuming it's fairly disease-free, and it should be around 12% moisture by weight. And so the maltster is going to steep it for 1 to 2 days until the moisture is around 40 to 48% total weight. Plenty of oxygen is introduced here as well, either by churning or forcing air up through the bottom of the grain bed. Strangely, just as an aside, I've heard some different opinions on this, like that barley doesn't need the oxygen, and even the suggestion that plants breathe CO2 and barley is a plant and ergo it doesn't need oxygen. So just to clarify, aerobic respiration is the key to glucose breakdown. This is germination and not photosynthesis. The barley needs oxygen. And so now we have target moisture and it's left to germinate. In the old days, floor malting really ruled, and that's exactly how it sounds. It's on the floor, and the chap sporting a certain amount of tweed comes in and rakes it and moves it around. Some places still do this, sort of like smaller craft maltsters, but mostly it's done on a larger scale mechanically. And so there's a drum malter, which will rotate. There's something called the Saladin box, which is just a giant sort of rectangular box where there's an auger that churns it around. There's other methods of pneumatic malting, tower malting, for example, or continuous malting are other methods, and we can maybe get into this a little later. And so now that this barley has been soaked, some rootlets are going to start to emerge, and they're called chits. And these would get all tangled with one another if we weren't churning it. So not only are we introducing air, but we're also keeping everything from being a tangled mess. And then, as we talked about earlier, the acrospire starts to grow. And enzymes start breaking stuff down, and a new plant gets ready to develop. So remember, we need all this stuff. And so as soon as target modification hits, the germination must stop. This is typically 4 to 6 days. And now a process called withering begins. And so the malt is dried out with fans. And now we have something called green malt. And then to completely halt the germination process, the malt is introduced to the kiln. So now we're also going to want color and flavor. And so the degree of kilning determines this, unless it's roasted, in which case it's the roaster that determines it. So as you can imagine, the hotter the kiln or roaster and the longer that the malt stays in there, the darker it's going to get. So you'll also recall that the enzymes are thermosensitive. And so once they get too hot, they denature, and renaturing is not a thing that exists. So the darker the malt, the lower the enzymatic potential. The lower the enzymatic potential, which is also called diastatic power, the lower the conversion into mash and the fewer fermentables, and the lower the possible attenuation for the beer. In other words, too much dark malt means not very good beer, or at least it's going to be really sweet and strange. And so this gets us a few malt categories. Base malts retain enough diastatic power to self-convert and often to lend a hand to the rest of the grist. They tend to be paler, as would stand to reason. Pilsner and pale malt are the two major variations. Caramel malts are used to add body to the beer, so they're made by loading green malt into the drum so it roasts and kind of stews the starches. And we'll get into that also a little later. The roasted malts are pale malts that have been then further roasted in the drum, and they add flavor and color and are rarely in excess of about 10% of the grain bill. And as mentioned, they can't self-convert due to the thermal annihilation of the enzymes, so they need to be accompanied by a malt that's got a lot of enzyme present. Okay, so let's go through exactly what happens in the malting and kilning or roasting process, and then go through some of the malts. So during malting, we see starches unlocked and somewhat broken down. Barley is about 60 to 70% carbohydrate, and these appear mostly in the forms of amylose, amylopectin, and some smaller fractions of dextrin, sucrose, and fructose. And so via enzymatic activity, some of the amylose and amylopectin are broken down into glucose, maltose, and maltotriose, along with some maltodextrins. So this is actually only around a 6 to 8% reduction, so most of them remain in their original longer forms. Barley, of course, also contains proteins, which are essential for what we call FAN, free amino nitrogens, in the wort. These appear mostly in the form of storage proteins, so hordein and glutenin. And these proteins are around 10 to 15% of weight. So enzymes active during the malting process, proteolytic enzymes, that is, will break these down into smaller peptides and amino acids, having more success on the hordeins than the glutenins, which are much harder to break down. And so there's something called the Kolbach index, which is the ratio of the total soluble nitrogen to total nitrogen, and this measures the degree of protein modification. And so 4% of the barley kernel is lipids and fatty acids, the majority of which are triglycerides, and these are primarily found in the alurone layer. A small fraction are sterols and sterile glycosides, and the remaining 20% or so are fatty acids, mostly oleic, linolenic, and palmitic acids. The malting process drastically reduces these by as much as 98.5% because they get hydrolyzed and then used for energy to start the new plant. So barley also contains a bunch of nutrients: B vitamins, iron, potassium, zinc, magnesium, calcium, and phosphorus, which are all key to healthy yeast. And so the cell walls also need to be dealt with to a degree, and these consist mostly of cellulose, hemicellulose, and beta-glucans, beta-glucans being the largest fraction. So cellulose is hard to break down, and it remains mostly intact. Hemicellulose can be partially broken down by hemicellulase enzymes, but a significant percentage remains unadulterated. And so glucanase can make a pretty good dent in the beta-glucans, reducing them to maltose and dextrins, which can be later reduced down to glucose. But as mentioned, the husk also contains a bunch of polyphenols, which can carry through and contribute to haze and astringency. Okay, so let's quickly talk about what happens in the kiln and the roaster. So flavor and color are added via two pathways, caramelization and the Maillard reaction. So I'm going to keep this general because Maillard is super complicated, and I feel like once I get off the rails here, there's probably no going back, and then we're all just going to get lost, especially me. So we'll just do Maillard and caramelization in a separate episode, and then it just gives me more to talk about. But, okay, so basically caramelization is the thermal decomposition of sugar, right? So, for example, sucrose will break down into glucose and fructose, but in the process, a bunch of aromatics are released, and various polymers form, giving the brown color. Maillard is similar, but it happens when amino acids, along with reducing sugars, are heated to somewhere between 140 and 160 degrees centigrade. And so for those of you who eat chicken, that brown crust when you grill or roast a chicken is an example of a Maillard reaction. And of course, which differentiates it from maybe like boiling it or something gross. Okay, so onto the malts. So by the way, the colors here can be reported in degrees Lovibond, which is the old style, the American Society of Brewing Chemists SRM, or Standard Reference Method, or the EBC method, which is the European Brewing Convention. Most of us just talk about Lovibond because it's kind of easier, and we're not going to necessarily go through all the colors of the malts. You can look those up. There's an article on the website that lists them all. Okay, so the base malts, as we discussed, are paler malts, which can convert both themselves and almost always the rest of the grist, including adjuncts like corn. So Pilsner malt is made from two-row, and it's mostly a European and UK thing. This makes up the base of most European beers, continental European beers, actually. And so kilning happens around 80 to 85 degrees Celsius. A fair amount of SMM, so S-methylmethionine, is present. So boil management is really key here to avoid any offensive off aromas there. Lager malt, which is also called pale malt, is an American six-row thing. It's got a ton of diastatic power, so it's very good for adjunct brewing. It's also pretty high in fan, which makes it suitable for adjunct brewing as well. Kilning is typically the same as Pilsner malt. Pale ale malt is mostly a UK thing, and actually a Belgian thing, incidentally. It tends to be lower in SMM, which is good. It's fairly well modified and gives that signature malt backbone to English ales. Vienna malt adds an amber color and lends a slightly toastier caramel kind of flavor. It's only kilned at about 90 to 95 degrees Celsius, and so it retains pretty good diastatic potential. Munich is slightly darker, but the color range is pretty wide here. It's like 6 to 12.5 degrees Lovibond. It too adds toast and caramel flavors, and while it can self-convert, it doesn't retain enough power to really help out anyone else. And it's kilned slightly higher at about 100 to 105 degrees Celsius. You might recall that Vienna and Munich malt were developed by Anton Dreyer and Gabriel Sedlmayr after learning those British malting techniques and bringing them back to Austria and Bavaria. So melanoidin malt, which is also called honey malt, is a sort of a souped-up Munich malt. It's kilned at 100 degrees Celsius, and it can usually self-convert, but it would be so overpowering if used in anything but small quantities, flavor-wise. Okay, so on to the caramel malts. So the process, we kind of alluded to it earlier, but it's sometimes referred to as husk mashing. And so these malts are loaded into the drum without being dried, and then steam is often introduced for the first little bit as well. And so the result is sort of a liquefaction of the sugars so that they can then recrystallize. So you get this kind of glassy texture in the inside. They're much less fermentable than most of the other malts and are mainly used to add body to the beer, really. They can also promote head retention via higher proteins. And so of those malts, special glassy, which is often called carapils or dextrin malt, that adds body and sweetness. And then the caramel or crystal malts, which come in a variety of colors, by the way, from a wide range of kiln temperatures, from like 155 to 210. And those both add color and flavor and are potent enough that, a lot of care is needed when introducing them into the mix. And so the roasted malts range in color from amber to black, really. And as mentioned, they almost completely lack any enzymatic power and rarely exceed 10% of the grist. So biscuit malt adds sort of a toasted bread crust flavor. It's key in brown ales, actually. Amber malt gives a toffee, bready sort of nuttiness. Brown malt adds some color along with some toffee and bread crust. And chocolate malt, it contributes chocolate and also some coffee-like flavors. And so black malt is really a key in porters and stouts, and it's a color bomb. It adds a slight bitterness as well and sort of roasted and burnt flavors. And while roasted barley isn't malted, it's just roasted barley, and it adds a roast character. It also will help to lighten the color of foam, and this is really key in Irish stouts. And then there's a couple of specialty malts that we should be aware of. Smoked malts, which are dried directly over wood fires, often beech. These are key in Rauch beers, and peated malt is basically the same deal, but it's fired over peat. And that's mostly used for Scotch. It's very rarely used in any beers. And then acidulated malt is made by allowing a lactobacillus to grow on the malt, which then provides acidity, of course, lowering the pH. And so it's a really sneaky way of lowering overall pH in the mash and in the beer while remaining within the confines of the Reinheitsgebot. It's also known, it is known as sour malts. Okay, then let's just quickly wrap up here. So barley is harvested, soaked, partially germinated, halted, dried, kilned, or roasted. Enzymes unlock the starch reserves. Caramelization and Maillard reactions contribute flavor and color. And then we're off to the mill, which we'll cover soon. Thanks for listening. And remember, if you enjoy the show, don't forget to rate, follow, subscribe, or like. And until next time, stay thirsty and stay curious.